All right, this is The Hiding Place, Chapter 14. It's by Corrie. The Blue Sweater. In the morning, a cold, wet mist hung over the Lagerstrasse. I was grateful that Betsy did not have to stand outside. All day, the blanketing fog hung over Ravensbruck, an eerie day when sound was muffled and the sun never rose. I was on potato detail, one of a crew hauling baskets of potatoes to long trenches to be covered with dirt against the freezing weather ahead. I was glad of the hard physical work that drove some of the damp from my bones and for the occasional bite of raw potato when guards were not watching. Next day, when the white pall still lay over the camp, my loneliness for Betsy became too much to bear. As soon as roll call was dismissed, I did a desperate thing. Mine had told me a way to get into the hospital without passing the guard post inside the door. The latrine at the rear, she said, had a very large window, too warped to close tight. Since no visiting was permitted in the hospital, relatives of patients often took this way of getting inside. In the dense fog, it was easy to get to the window unseen. I hoisted myself through it and then clapped my hand to my nose against the stinging odor. A row of lidless, doorless toilets stretched along one wall in the pool of their overflow. I dashed for the door, then stopped, my flesh crawling. Against the opposite wall, a dozen naked corpses lay side by side on their backs. Some of the eyes were open and seemed to stare unblinkingly at the ceiling. I was standing there, lead-footed with horror, when two men pushed through the door carrying a sheet-wrapped-like bundle between them. They did not even glance at me, and I realized they took me for a patient. I ducked around them into the hall and stood a moment, stomach nodding with the sight I had seen. After a while, I started aimlessly off to the left. The hospital was a maze of halls and doors. Already I was not sure of the way to get back to the latrine. What if the potato crew left before I got back? And then a corridor looked familiar. I hurried, almost running from door to door. At last, the ward where I had left Betsy. No hospital personnel was in sight. I walked eagerly down the aisles of cots, looking from face to face. Corrie! Betsy was sitting up in a cot near the window. She looked stronger, eyes bright, a touch of color in her sunken cheeks. No nurse or doctor had seen her yet, she said, but the chance to lie still and stay indoors had already made a difference. 3 days afterward, Betsy returned to Barracks 28. She still had received no examination or medicine of any kind, and her forehead felt feverish to my touch, but the joy of having her back outweighed my anxiety. Best of all, as a result of her hospitalization, she was given a permanent assignment to the knitting brigade, the women we had seen the very first day seated about the tables in the center room. This work was reserved for the weakest prisoners, and now overflowed into the dormitories as well. Those working in the sleeping rooms received far less supervision than those at the tables, and Betsy found herself with most of the day in which to minister to those around her. She was a lightning knitter who completed her quota of socks long before noon. She kept her Bible with her and spent hours each day reading aloud from it, moving from platform to platform. One evening, I got back to the barracks late from a wood gathering foray outside the walls. A light snow lay on the ground, and it was hard to find the sticks and twigs with which a small stove was kept going in each room. Betsy was waiting for me, as always, so that we could wait through the food line together. Her eyes were twinkling. "You look extraordinarily pleased with yourself," I told her. "You know, we've never understood why we had so much freedom in the big room," she said. "Well, I found out." That afternoon, she said, there'd been confusion in her knitting group about the sock sizes, and they asked the supervisor to come and settle it. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't step through the door, and neither would the guards, and you know why? Betsy could not keep the triumph from her voice. "Because of the fleas! That's what she said. That place is crawling with fleas!" My mind rushed back to our first hour in this place. I remembered Betsy's bowed head, remembered her thanks to God for creatures I could see no use for. Though Betsy was now spared heavy outdoor labor, she still had to stand the twice-daily roll call. As December temperatures fell, the roll calls became true endurance tests, and many did not survive. One dark morning, when ice was forming a halo around each street lamp, a feeble-minded girl 2 rows ahead of us suddenly soiled herself. A guard rushed at her, swinging her thick leather crop, while the girl shrieked in pain and terror. It was almost more terrible when one of these innocents were beaten. Still, the officer continued to whip her. It was the guard we had nicknamed the Snake, because of the shiny dress she wore. I could see it now beneath her long wool cape, glittering in the light of the lamp as she raised her arm. I was grateful when the screaming girl at last lay still on the cinder street. Betsy, I whispered when the snake was far enough away. What can we do for these people? Afterward, I mean. Can't we make a home for them and care for them and love them? Corrie, I pray every day that we will be allowed to do this, to show them that love is greater. And it wasn't until I was gathering twigs later in the morning that I realized that I had been thinking of the feeble-minded, and Betsy of their persecutors. Several days later, my entire work crew was ordered to the hospital for medical inspection. I dropped my dress onto the pile just inside the door and joined the file of naked women. Ahead of us, to my surprise, a doctor was using a stethoscope with all the deliberateness of a real examination. What is this for? I whispered to the woman ahead of me. Transportation inspection, she hissed back, not moving her head. Munitions work. Transport? But they mustn't send me away. Dear God, don't let them take me away from Betsy. But to my terror, I passed one station after another, heart, lungs, scalp, throat, and still I was in the line. Many were pulled out along the way, but those who remained looked hardly stronger. Swollen stomachs, hollow chests, spindly legs, how desperate for vampire Germany must be. I halted before a woman in a soiled white coat. She turned my face around to a chart on the wall, her hand cold on my bare shoulder. Read the lowest line you can. I can't seem to read any of them. Lord, forgive me. Just the top letter, that big E. The top letter was an F. The woman seemed to see me for the first time. You could see better than that, don't you? Do you want to be rejected? At Ravensbruck, munitions transport was considered a privilege. Food and living conditions in the factories were said to be far better than here in the camp. Oh, yes, doctor. My sister's here at Ravensbruck. She's not well. I can't leave her. The doctor sat down at her table and scrawled something on the piece of paper. Come back tomorrow to be fitted for glasses. Catching up to the line, I unfolded the small blue slip of paper. Prisoner 66730 was instructed to report for an optical fitting at 6:30 the following morning. 6:30 was the time the transport convoys were loaded. So, as the huge vans rumbled down the Lagerstrasse the next day, I was standing in a corridor of the hospital waiting my turn at the eye clinic. The young man in charge was perhaps a qualified eye doctor, but its entire equipment consisted of a box of frame glasses, from gold-rimmed bifocals to plastic-framed child's pair. I found none that fitted, and at last was ordered back to my work detail. But of course, I had no work assignment, having been marked down for transport. I walked back uncertainly toward Barracks 28. I stepped into the center of the room. The supervisor looked up over the heads of the knitting crew. Number, she said. I gave it, and she wrote it in the black-covered book. Pick up your yarn and a pattern sheet, she went on. You'll have to find a place on one of the beds. There's no room here. And she turned back to a pile of finished socks on the table. I stood blinking in the center of the room, then grabbed a skein of the dark gray wool. I dashed through the dormitory door. And thus began the closest, most joyous weeks of all time at Ravensbruck. Side by side in the sanctuary of God's fleas, Betsy and I ministered the word of God to all in the room. We sat by deathbeds that became doorways of heaven. We watched women who had lost everything grow rich in hope. The knitters of Barracks 28 became the praying heart of the vast diseased body that was Ravensbruck, interceding for all the camp, guards, under Betsy's prodding, as well as prisoners. We prayed beyond the concrete walls for the healing of Germany, of Europe, of the world, as Mama had once done from the prison of a crippled body. And as we prayed, God spoke to us about the world after the war. It was extraordinary. In this place where whistles and loudspeakers of the place took the place of decisions, God asked us what we were going to do in the years ahead. Betsy was always very clear about the answer for her and me. We were to have a house, a large one, much larger than the brigade, to which people who had been damaged by concentration camp life would come until they felt ready to live again in the normal world. It's such a beautiful house, Corrie. The floors are all inlaid wood, with statues set in the walls and a broad staircase sweeping down. And gardens all around it where they can plant flowers. It will do them such good, Corrie, to care for flowers. I would stare at Betsy in amazement as she talked about these things. She spoke always as though she were describing things that she saw, as if the wide, winding staircase of those bright gardens were the reality, this cramped and filthy barracks the dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was really, achingly, endlessly true, and it was always during roll calls that the accumulated misery threatened to overwhelm me. One morning, 3 women from Barrack 28 lingered inside a few minutes to avoid the cold. All the following week, the entire barracks was punished by an extra hour at attention. The lights on the Lagerstrasse were not even lit when we were driven from our bunks at 3:30 a.m. It was during this pre-inspection lineup one morning that I saw what I had till then refused to believe. Headlights appeared at the far end of a long street, wavering over the snow. Trucks with open flatbeds in the rear were approaching, splattering slush as they passed. They pulled up at the front door of the hospital. The door opened and a nurse appeared, supporting an old woman whose legs buckled as she limped down the steps. The nurse lifted her gently onto the back of a truck. They were pouring out the door now, leaning on the arms of nurses and hospital helpers, the old, the ill. Last of them came orderlies with stretchers between them. Our eyes took in every detail of the scene. Our brains refused. We had known, of course, that when overcrowding reached a certain point, the sickest were taken to the brick building at the foot of the great square smokestack. But that these women here in front of us, these very ones, it was not possible. Above all, I could not put it together with the kindly behavior of the nurses. That one in the truck just ahead, bending solicitously, even tenderly over her patient. What was passing through her mind just now? And all the while it grew colder. One night during evening roll call, a platoon somewhere far down the Lagerstrasse began a rhythmic stamping. The sound grew as others picked it up. The guards did not stop us, and at last the entire street was marching in place, pounding tattered shoes against the frozen ground, driving circulation back into numb feet and legs. From now on, this was the sound of roll call, the stamping of thousands of feet on the long, dark street. And as the cold increased, so did the special temptation of the concentration camp life, the temptation to think only of oneself. It took 1,000 cunning forms. I quickly discovered that when I maneuvered our way toward the middle of the roll call formation, we had a little protection from the wind. I knew this was self-centered. When Betsy and I stood in the center, someone else had to stand on the edge. How easy it was to give it other names. I was acting only for Betsy's sake. We were in an important ministry and must keep well. It was colder in Poland than in Holland. These Polish women probably were not feeling the chill the way we were. Selfishness had a life of its own. As I watched mine's bag of yeast compound disappear, I began taking it from beneath the straw only after lights out, when others would not see and ask for more. Wasn't Betsy's health more important? You see, God, she can do so much for them. Remember that house after the war? And even if it wasn't right, it wasn't so very wrong, was it? Not wrong like sadism or murder and the other monstrous evils we saw in Ravensbruck every day. Oh, this was the great ploy of Satan that in that kingdom of his, to display such blatant evil that one could almost believe one's own secret sins didn't matter. The cancer spread. The second week in December, every occupant of Barracks 28 was issued an extra blanket. The next day, a large group of evacuees arrived from Czechoslovakia. One of them assigned to our platform had no blanket at all, and Betsy insisted that we give her one of ours. So that evening, I lent her a blanket, but I didn't give it to her. In my heart, I held on to the right to that blanket. Was it coincidence that joy and power imperceptibly drained from my ministry? My prayers took on a mechanical ring. Even Bible reading was dull and lifeless. Betsy tried to take over for me, but her cough made reading aloud impossible. And so I struggled on with worship and teaching that had ceased to be real, until one drizzly raw afternoon, when just enough light came through the window to read by, I came to Paul's account of his thorn in the flesh. 3 times, he said, he had begged God to take away his weakness, whatever it was, and each time God had said, "Rely on me." At last, Paul concluded, the words seemed to leap from the page, that his very weakness was something to give thanks for, because now Paul knew that none of the wonders and miracles that followed his ministry could be due to his own virtues. It was all Christ's strength, never Paul's. And there it was. The truth blazed like sunlight in the shadows of Barracks 28. The real sin I had been committing was not that of inching towards the center of the platoon because I was cold. The real sin lay in thinking that any power to help and transform came from me. Of course, it was not my wholeness, but Christ that made the difference. The short winter day was fading. I could no longer separate the words on the page. And so I closed the Bible, and to that group of women clustering close, I told the truth about myself, my self-centeredness, my stinginess, my lack of love. That night, real joy returned to my worship. Each roll call, the wind seemed sharper. Whenever she could, mine smuggled newspapers from the staff room at the hospital, which we placed inside our clothes. Nolly's blue sweater beneath Betsy's dress was black with newsprint. The cold seemed to be affecting Betsy's legs. Sometimes in the morning, she could not move them at all, and two of us would have to carry her between us. It was not hard. She weighed no more than a child, but she could no longer stamp her feet as the rest of us did to keep the blood flowing. When we returned to the dormitory, I would rub her feet and hands, but my own only picked up the chill from hers. It was the week before Christmas that Betsy woke up, unable to move either legs or arms. I shoved my way through the crowded aisles to the center room. The snake was on duty. "Please," I begged, "Betsy's ill. Oh, please, she's got to go to the hospital." "Stand at attention. State your number." "Prisoner 66730 reporting. Please, my sister is sick." "All prisoners must report for the count. If she's sick, she could register at sick call." Merk de Graaf, a Dutch woman on the tier above ours, helped me form a cradle with our arms and carry Betsy outside. The rhythmic stamping had already begun in the Lagerstrasse. We carried her to the hospital, then stopped. In the light of the street lamps, the sick call line stretched to the edge of the building and out of sight around the corner. In the sooty snow alongside, 3 bodies lay where they had fallen. Without a word, Marek and I turned and carried our load back to the Lagerstrasse. After roll call, we got her back into bed. Her speech was slow and blurred, but she was trying to say something. "A camp, Corrie. A concentration camp. But we're in charge." I had to bend very close to hear. The camp was in Germany. It was no longer a prison, but a home where people who had been warped by this philosophy of hate and force could come to learn another way. There were no walls, no barbed wire, and the barracks had window boxes. It would be good for them, watching things grow. People can learn love from flowers. I knew by now which people she meant. The German people. I thought of the snake standing in the barracks door that morning. "State your number. All prisoners must report for the count." I looked at Betsy's shrunken face. "Are we to have this camp in Germany instead, Betsy? Instead of the big house in Holland?" "Oh, no!" She seemed shocked. "You know we have the house first. It's ready and waiting for us. Such tall, tall windows. The sun is streaming in." A coughing fit seized her. When she finally lay still, a stain of blood blackened the straw. She dozed fitfully during the day and night that followed, waking several times with the excitement of some new detail about our work in Holland or Germany. "The barracks are gray, Corrie, but we'll paint them green, bright, light green, like springtime. We'll be together, Betsy? We're doing all this together? You're sure about that?" "Always together, Corrie. You and I, always together." When the siren blew next morning, Marek and I again carried Betsy from the dormitory. The snake was standing at the street door. As we started through it with our fragile burden, she stepped in front of us. "Take her back to the bunks." "I thought all take her back." Wonderingly, we placed Betsy on the bed. Sleet rattled against the windows. Was it possible that the atmosphere of Barracks 28 had affected even this cruel guard? As soon as roll call was dismissed, I ran back to the dormitory. There, beside her bed, stood the snake. Beside her, 2 orderlies from the hospital were setting down a stretcher. The snake straightened almost guiltily as I approached. "Prisoner is ready for transfer," she snapped. I looked at the woman more closely. Had she risked fleas and lice to spare Betsy the sick call line? She did not stop me as I started after the stretcher. Our group of knitters was just entering the big room. As we passed, a Polish friend dropped to her knees and made the sign of a cross. Sleet stung us as we reached the outside. I stepped close to the stretcher to form a shield for Betsy. We walked past the waiting line of sick people, through the door and into the large ward. They placed the stretcher on the floor. I leaned down to make out Betsy's words. "Must tell people what we have learned here. We must tell them that there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. They will listen to us, Corrie, because we've been here." I stared at her wasted form. "But when will this happen, Betsy?" "Now. Right now. Well, very soon. By the first of the year, Corrie, we will be out of prison." A nurse had caught sight of me. I backed to the door of the room and watched as they placed Betsy on a narrow cot close to the window. I ran around to the outside of the building. At last, Betsy caught sight of me. We exchanged smiles and soundless words until one of the camp police shouted at me to move along. About noontime, I put down my knitting and went to the center room. Prisoner 66730 reporting. Request permission to visit the hospital? I stood ramrod straight. The snake glanced up, then scrawled out a pass. Outside, it was still sleeting. I reached the door of the ward, but the horrible nurse would not let me enter, even with my pass, so I went again to the window next to Betsy's cot. I waited until the nurse left the room, then tapped gently. Betsy's eyes opened. Slowly, she turned her head. Are you all right? I formed with my lips. She nodded. You must get a good rest, I went on. She moved her lips in reply, but I could not follow. She formed the words again. I bent my head to one side, level with hers, the blue lips open again. So much work to do. The snake was off duty during the afternoon and evening, and though I asked the other guards repeatedly, I did not again get permission to leave. The minute roll call was dismissed the following morning, I headed for the hospital, permission or no. I reached the window and cut my eyes to peer in. A nurse was standing directly between me and Betsy. I ducked out of sight, waited a minute, then looked again. A second nurse had joined the first, both now standing where I wanted to see. They stepped to the head in front of the bed. I gazed curiously at what lay on it. It was a carving in old yellow ivory. There was no clothing on the figure. I could see each ivory rib and the outline of the teeth through the parchment cheeks. It took me a moment to realize it was Betsy. The nurses had each seized 2 quarters of the sheet. They lifted it between them and carried the bundle from the room before my heart had started to beat again in my chest. Betsy, but she had too much to do. She could not. Where were they taking her? Where had they gone? I turned from the window and began running along the side of the building, chest hurting me as I breathed. Then I remembered the washroom. That window at the rear, that was where my feet carried me mechanically around to the back of the building, and there with my hand on the windowsill I stopped. Suppose she was there. Suppose they had laid Betsy on that floor. I started walking again. I walked for a long time, still with that pain in my chest, and each time my feet took me back to the washroom window. I would not go in. I would not look. Betsy could not be there. I walked some more. Strangely enough, although I passed several camp police, no one stopped or questioned me. Corrie! I turned around to see mine running after me. Corrie, I've looked for you everywhere. Oh, Corrie, come. She seized my arm and drew me back toward the hospital. When I saw where she was headed, I wrenched my arm free. I know mine. I know already. She didn't seem to hear. She seized me again and led me to the washroom window and pushed me in ahead of her. In the reeking room, I stood a nurse. I drew back in alarm, but mine was behind me. This is the sister, mine said to the nurse. I turned my head to the side. I would not look at the bodies that lined the far wall. Mine put an arm around my shoulder and drew me across the room till we were standing above the heartbreaking row. Corrie, do you see her? I raised my eyes to face Betsy's. Lord Jesus, what have you done? Oh, Lord, what are you saying? What are you giving me? For there lay Betsy, her eyes closed as if in sleep, her face full and young. The care lines, the grief lines, the deep hollows of hunger and disease were simply gone. In front of me was the Betsy of Harlem, happy and at peace, stronger, freer. This was the Betsy of heaven, bursting with joy and health. Even her hair was graciously in place as if an angel had ministered to her. At last I looked wonderingly to mine. The nurse went silently to the door and opened it for us herself. You can leave through the hall, she said softly. I looked once more at the radiant face of my sister. Then mine and I left the room together. A pile of clothes was heaped outside in the hallway. On top lay Molly's blue sweater. I stopped to pick it up. The sweater was threadbare and stained with newsprint, but it was a tangible link with Betsy. Mine seized my arm. Don't touch those things. Black lice, they'll all be burned. And so I left behind the last physical tie. It was just as well. It was better. Now, what tied me to Betsy was the hope of heaven. And that's the end of chapter 14. You'll have to come back for chapter 15.